Welcome. We're glad you're here for tonight's presentation of Love in the Age of Epilepsy in partnership with Lee Shepard, LPC at Thousand Hills Therapy and Consulting. Lee is a mama by birth and adoption to kids with superpowers and special needs. Her daughter Alyssa has PCDH19, and Lee has been involved with the Alliance since Alyssa's diagnosis. She's also an experienced counselor who specializes in working with couples and people on difficult parenting journeys. She sees couples and individuals online across Texas. When she's not seeing clients, you can find Lee homeschooling, hiking, or hidden off in the corner with a book. And now I'll hand it over to Lee.
Thank you so much, Julie. I am really excited to be here. So just a little bit about me as we kind of get started. I have 3 kids. My oldest 2 have special needs. My youngest 2 are adopted through foster care. And my daughter Alyssa has PCDH19. She was diagnosed with it 7 years ago today, actually. And so we've kind of been on this journey for a while. But so I always like to start by telling you about an experience, probably one of the most intense moments of my entire marriage. But for you to understand that, you kind of have to know a couple of things about me. First of all, you need to know that I live way out in the sticks. We are incredibly rural. It takes me 45 minutes to get to a Target. And so I have to go into the next big town just to be able to go to Walmart, and Walmart's the only option that we have. And then you should also know that there are some things that I'm really like finicky, we'll say, about. Like I'm generally kind of like I can handle a lot, but then there's some things where it's like, nope, this is the only way it can be. And one of those things is highlighters. Highlighters should always only be yellow and skinny with the lid that comes off. Like they should never be the fat kind. They should never be the clickiness, and absolutely never any other colors, right? I'm like really particular about my highlighters. But I also lose highlighters a lot. And so a couple of years ago, or several years ago now, I was in this really hard semester of grad school, and Alyssa was having these seizures that were just really, really out of control. And at this same time, Walmart, which like I said, is the only thing in our county, ran out of highlighters. And every single time I would go to Walmart, I would go and I would look for highlighters, and I would end up buying this giant package of all these million different colors of highlighters, because I needed the 1 or 2 little yellow ones in there. And I, like it was stressful. It was, but again, normally that's one of those things that you can kind of handle. You just go along with it. But we were in the hospital, and they came and they couldn't get these seizures stopped. And they're telling us, look, Alyssa's body cannot handle many more of these seizures. If we can't get them stopped, we don't know what's going to happen. And so they take her down for another MRI, and I'm like trying to do grad school work in the hospital while she's doing this MRI, all sorts of stress. And I get my bag out, and I was out of yellow highlighters. And it was just one of those things where like that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm like kind of panicking and freaking out. And I really kind of lose it. And this is one of those moments where my husband has this opportunity that nobody would have judged him if he'd been like, look, you're nuts. Why are you freaking out about a highlighter? This is stupid. Our kid is in all this crisis. What does it matter? And instead, he went out to the nurse's desk and he asked the nurse to borrow a highlighter. And I'm just like, oh, okay, we're going to be all right. And a few minutes later, he comes back in, and he kind of like has that look on his face walking in the door, like something bad is about to go down. And he says, so she said no. The nurse won't let you have her highlighter. And I lost it probably bigger than I've lost it in most of our marriage. Like it was ugly tears, it was hyperventilation, it was crying. And again, in this moment, he has this opportunity to slam the door, stomp out, and nobody would have judged him, right? Nobody would have said, like, go back there, be kind, do whatever, because everyone would have said, she's nuts, she doesn't care about her kid, what's wrong with her, she's cares about this highlighter when everything else is going wrong. And instead, what he did is he snuck back outside and he stole me a highlighter, right? And in that moment, there was this just like kind of overwhelming, we can do this. We're in it together. We're going to make it. He's my guy. He's even willing to steal me highlighters, right? And I say that because those kind of moments happen in our kinds of marriages a lot, where everything is falling apart. And the thing we have to remember is that we are going to fall. There are going to be times on this journey of parenting kids with PCDH19 that you absolutely crash. You spend the day with your face on the floor, right? And our trick is that we've got to learn how to fall together instead of apart, right? How to end up with each other. So we're going to talk about that some today. We're going to talk about, because the truth is that we're designed to handle hard things, but we're just not designed to handle them alone. And what we find that we do is that when we hit these crises, we tend to spiral and we either end up really, really close or we end up on opposite sides of the room. And so as we learn to handle things together, we can cope with them a bit easier. There's this beautiful study. I'm kind of a research geek. I love studies. And there's this beautiful study where they took people and they showed them this mountain. And they asked them how big this mountain is and how long it was going to take them to climb up this mountain. And then they brought them back with their person. So they brought their partner or their spouse with them. And they looked at that mountain. And when we look at the mountain and we have our person with us, the mountain's not as big. And it's not going to be as hard of a climb to the top. And it's not going to take us as long to get to the top. Because everything shifts when we have a person with us. Okay? We do want to recognize, though, that our marriages are not going to look normal. Okay? If you're comparing your relationship to a neurotypical family, you're going to judge yourself. You're going to think that you're doing things wrong because it's not going to look the same. You're going to have different demands on you as individuals and as a couple because of those special needs. And you're each going to end up coping in different ways. And sometimes there's some conflict in the ways that we cope, and so if each person is handling things differently or if each person is struggling differently, it can cause some conflict. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on connection and we're going to focus on some really practical things that we can do to help us stay more connected. But as we get started, I want to talk for just a second about this journey that we're on. And we want to recognize that what we're experiencing here is trauma. And we use that word really purposefully, that as parents of kids with PCDH19, there are times that you might watch your child turn blue, you're watching seizures, you're spending nights in the hospital, you're getting diagnoses, you're going through these incredibly difficult things, and they put you into this survival mode. It's that fight, flight, freeze space. Or we get into really high stress spaces and we stay in those spots. And that trauma, that is not like a typical parent having a typical bad day. These take things to a different level in the way we cope with them, in our relationships, and even physically in our brain. So we know that our brains change as we focus or as we walk through trauma. And we know that that trauma comes back and deeply impacts our relationships. So especially if one of the parents or both of the parents are experiencing trauma symptoms like PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, super high anxiety, deep, deep grief, that's going to show up in how we relate to each other and how we relate to our children and how we relate to ourselves. Okay, and so we want to own that this is trauma, this is big, and this is hard. We're going to expect that as we go through this, we're going to be in different places. The things that really get to me are different than the things that really get to my husband. And that's okay. That's completely expected, because the things that I expected out of parenting are different than the things that he expects, right? The things that I dreamed about look different than the things that he dreamed about. Even though, you know, we can kind of be on the same page, there's pieces that I might have always dreamed about that look different now, and I have to experience those and agree in a way that he might not, and it goes both ways, right? We're going to both find acceptance for what we're going through in different ways and at different times, okay? And so what we expect is that we go through this kind of going through the same challenges in the same direction, but on very different paths, okay? And so if I look over and I see that he's responding differently than me, I might judge that if I don't understand, well, he's just in a different space. You know, and so one of the things I remember is when Alyssa was newly diagnosed and I was spiraling pretty hard, I remember coming home one day and he was sitting on the couch with our kids watching a movie. And I saw this and I was just livid. I was so mad because I'm like, what are you doing? We have to be researching. We have to find a cure. We have to do something that will fix this. And you're over there watching a movie with our kids. And he's like, well, but you know, I kind of figure if we don't have as long as we want to have, we should make the most of this time. And I'm just like it was just a total disconnect because I was in this space that was just really, really desperate for, I have to find an answer. I have to make this better, right? And eventually I get to the space where, you know what, spending time with our children is probably a good thing. But it just kind of takes a bit of time to get there sometimes. We also expect that the trauma triggers are going to be different for each of you. So both of you can walk through the same exact medical crisis, and one of you might have sounds that really get to you, and one of you might have a look on the face or something different, and we totally expect that. We want to help each other learn those triggers and learn those responses so that we can walk through them together. What we see in relationships is that in most relationships, we end up having this thing that we call our negative cycle. And our negative cycle, you can kind of think about the last time you got into an argument. And if you think about how that argument went, it probably looks really similar to every other argument you've had in the last 6 months. Okay, it's going to go through the same pace. One person says this, they see this look in their eye, and then they amp up, and then they amp up, and then somebody shuts down, and we go through the same exact steps over and over and over. And so one of the things we really want to do when we're thinking about how to preserve our relationships is we want to notice that cycle and figure out exactly what it looks like. Because then what we can do is start to notice when we're starting to get into it. If we notice, hey, you know what, we are starting to jump into that cycle, then we can slow it down, then we can act different towards each other. We can make different decisions that are going to change the outcome of the night, right? So as we're thinking about our cycles, we want to look at what are the things that trigger disconnection for y'all. What do you feel in your body when that happens? And so even before you're mad, you might notice that you're clenching your fist. You might notice that your heart starts to beat and you feel super, super anxious as soon as you see their eyebrows go up. We want to notice what we're thinking. And so it might be something like, well, here we go again, or dang, they're mad at me again, or I can't believe they did this, or I'm so stupid, or whatever that thought is. But there's probably a thought that happens pretty consistently. And we want to start noticing that. That's going to tell us where we're at in the relationship, and it's going to help us understand like how that cycle progresses. Okay. And as soon as we notice that, like, what are we thinking? We want to notice, what are we doing? Okay. And so when you first notice, like, oh, they're mad at me, do you leave? Do you jump up? Do you go to, here's everything you've ever done wrong in your life? We have one cycle we like to call finding the bad guy, where we kind of get back and forth, and it goes into this, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, no, we've got to blame one of us, and it's going to be you, right? And so we start looking for that cycle there, and what do we do in there? Okay, and is that the thing that we want to be doing? So are you showing up in an argument in the way that you're going to be proud of, that you want to be showing up? And then when you do that, how are they responding? So, if I do this, maybe my intention is good. Maybe I'm wanting to get my point across, but is that working? How are they responding? And then how do I respond back? And then we want to think about, how does it end? Okay. So eventually all arguments diffuse. But is it that we stomp out the door? Is it that we threaten divorce? Is it that we hit pause? And if we do we come back afterwards? So if somebody walks away, is there a time when we're like, okay, let's come back to this conversation? Or does it just never get brought up again, right? And so we want to really pay attention to, what does that cycle look like for y'all? Okay. And within this cycle, what you're going to find is that you probably have one of 4 main attachment styles. Okay? Our attachment styles have to do with the way we respond when we meet our people. Okay? And so we kind of think about it like this spectrum that goes from withdrawer over to pursuer. Okay? And so if you're a withdrawer, then when things get really tense, or when things get really scary in the relationship, you probably tend to go inside your turtle shell, right? You're going to shut down. You're going to say things in your head like, there's nothing I can do to make this any better, so I'm just going to shut down. You're going to protect the relationship by getting quiet, or by going inside of yourself and not sharing. Okay? And so we have, on this end, we have our withdrawers, and then on our other side, we have what we call our pursuers. Okay? And our pursuers are people that when things get anxiety provoking, when things are scary, we want to grab a hold of our person and hold them as tight as we can. I'm going to make sure that I've got you tight enough that I'm never going to lose you. I'm not going to let you go. Okay? And in most relationships, we end up with one of both. And so we've got one person who's trying to grab a hold, and then we've got one person who's trying to go into their turtle shell. Okay? And especially when we're amped up, that can cause some problems, right? So we're going to notice that about ourselves. What am I? What is my person? And how is that playing out? Now, what we really expect is that if we're in a solid relationship, we get to this space that we call being secure. And in a secure spot, it means I can be mad at you, and I still know you're not going to leave. I still know that we're going to be okay. We're going to make it through. And I don't feel that massive panic that everything is just about to crash. Okay. But even if we're in a secure spot, whenever we get activated, whenever things are really hard, we tend to go back towards either that pursuer or withdrawer stance. And that's okay, right? That's just kind of how you're wired. We know that we can look at 18-month-olds and determine their attachment styles and predict, and it's almost always going to be the same thing when you're 40. Okay, so that's just who you are. It's just how you learned to get your needs met when you were tiny. And so we accept what it is, and we work towards being more secure and earning that security in our relationship. Okay. Now, for some people, especially if you grow up in a really difficult space, you can get into this, what we call ancient avoidance spot. And there's a lot of, even inside of you, there's a lot of push-pull. And so sometimes you want to grab a hold, and sometimes you want to go in that shell, and it can feel really chaotic. But we know that even in that spot, we can go back, we can work towards being in that secure space where maybe the rest of the world still gets scary, but I know that my person is safe, and I know that I can be me with them, and that they're not going to leave, even when we fight, right? So we're still going to fight. We're still going to get in this cycle sometimes. Our goal is not to never have a fight, because that's just not realistic. But we're going to get to this space where we're not afraid even when we're there. And what we know is that that stress makes it easier to get stuck in the cycle, and it makes it easier to go deeper into that attachment space. And so that's one of the reasons why we're paying so much attention to them. Okay? You know, I like to think about that we have these things, these triggers, that if we're normally in a healthy spot and things are going okay at home, they might cause a little bit of a flare up, but we can handle them. And they're not quite as scary. But when your kid's in the hospital, or the seizures won't stop, or everything's chaotic, then all of a sudden it gets to be a lot more to take in. And so one of the things I think about, I have a 40-foot camper that I pull with my giant dually truck. It's so much fun. We've taken it all over the place. But you know, the first time I was driving it by myself in Colorado, it was just me and the kids. We were going to pick my husband up in Denver. And so I'm going through these mountains. And in Texas, we don't have mountains. We have flats, right? With like minor bumps. And so if I'm in Texas and I drive across a little bridge or something and there's guardrails on the side, I don't even notice them. I do not pay attention to those, right? It's just like, whatever, just, you know, drive straight, don't fall in the creek. But we're driving in Colorado and you're going up these mountains that are just obscene, and you're, you know, like almost straight up, and there's these hairpin turns, and it's so scary. And there are no guardrails anywhere. You're like inches from, you know, like I've got these massive tires, and so they're like 6 inches from sudden death off the side of a cliff, and there's no guardrails anywhere. And then, you know, so first you're like really freaked out every time that you don't see guardrails. And then eventually you get to this space where when you do see guardrails, it's terrifying, because you're like, how many people had to die on this curve for them to decide to put guardrails here? Okay. It's just like, what's going on? But in our relationships, I think a lot of times those initial cues for our cycle, those eyebrows going up, those, you know, or those words that tell us like we're about to get in it, it's kind of serve like guardrails. That if we're in a healthy spot, we can kind of make this choice that says, just keep going, work through the conversation, we're going to be okay. But when we're in a really hard spot, when everything's really scary already, when the relationship is really struggling, then all of a sudden those guardrails are terrifying. And we're so much more likely to spin out even harder, because we're really struggling with, somebody died on this corner. Something horrible must have happened. And we're trying so hard that we really, really struggle. Okay. So we're going to watch for those guardrails, and we're also going to watch for these things that we call raw spots. Okay? And raw spots are things that everybody has. Raw spots are those things that we carry into relationships or we carry through life, and they hurt when they get bumped up against them. And so several years ago, I had my thyroid taken out, and I can't wear chunky necklaces anymore, right? And because they did some kind of nerve damage. And so if I wear chunky necklaces, it hurts. And there's nothing wrong with chunky necklaces. I have a bunch of them in my bathroom still. But I can't wear them because for me, that's a raw spot. We have those in parenting, in life, in our relationships. And when they get bumped up against, they hurt. Okay. And so, you know, so one for me would be, I hate being called lucky. I had a doctor say that I would be lucky if Alyssa lived to be 18, and I cringe if I hear that word. Okay, I can't stand it. There's nothing wrong with the word. People use it in normal human conversation every day. But for me, that's a raw spot, right? And so if my person knows that that's a word that's gonna just, you know, like blow or top or make her anxious, then they learn to not use that word. Right? And we have those, whether it's from parenting, whether it's from our histories, our outside traumas, or even from within this relationship. So we want to start learning where those are for each other. What are the things that if those get bumped up again, it just really, really hurts? And how do we protect each other there? And as we're doing that, we're also going to work really hard to start creating space for whatever you and your person feel, even the really ugly stuff, okay? This is a space where, especially on this kind of parenting journey, that there's hard feelings. There are things that come up that maybe you have horrible thoughts about your child sometimes. Maybe you want to get in your car and drive away and never come back. Maybe you are so overwhelmed that you don't think you can handle it. Those are really typical experiences for a lot of parents on this journey. Okay? And what we need to do is recognize that that's part of what's going to come up. So we're going to create space for it. We're going to give each other room to talk about that stuff. And we're going to recognize that even when you have those days that, like, I don't think I can handle this kid anymore, that's not a lack of love. It's not that at all. All it is this space of, I need to talk about it. I need some grace here. We're also going to get to that spot where we learn to say the hard things and hear the hard things when our person can't say them. So if we think about that day with the highlighter, I didn't have the words that day for, I don't know how to walk out of here without my kid. I didn't have the ability to say, I am terrified and everything is crashing and I can't handle it. I had the words for, this blankety blankety blank highlighter is the wrong blankety blank color. Okay, I can say that out loud. And so what we end up doing is we take all of this pressure, all of this overwhelm, and we put it on the highlighter. Okay, and so what we have to do is when it's our person and we're watching that happen, we want to recognize my spouse is normally a rational human being. They would not normally lose it this big over this. They're probably actually reacting to all the other chaos in our world. Okay, but we also want to get to this space where we can talk about that part, where we can say, you know what, I am terrified right now. You know what, I can't handle this today. And so we're looking to kind of do both, where we want to hear our people even when they don't have those words yet, but we also want to look at creating those words. And as we're doing that, one of the things we're doing is we're starting to make these positive assumptions. So we're choosing to believe that our people are good people, that when they're lashing out, it's because they're hurting, not because they're bad. And that right there, that makes this shift, that makes it a whole lot easier to show up for each other. So I want to talk about some of the real practical things that we can do. One of the things that we learned really early on is to set aside time to talk about the diagnosis and also to take a break from it. So, you know, when Alyssa was first having seizures, when they first got really, really bad, I was in grad school and there was this one other student who was really kind of a bully. And I mean, she was just really awful. And I would come home, and normally, you know, in our relationship, I would come home, we would sit down for dinner, and I would say, oh my gosh, you would not believe what this person said today. It was awful. She did da 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 da. And what I found was that it was really hard to have that conversation anymore because it felt really petty. It felt really stupid to talk about the mean girl at school when my own kid was falling apart, when my other children were struggling and everything was in chaos. And so what we learned to do was to take a date night when we finally could get one, and we made this choice to leave epilepsy at home, okay? But it was off the table. And what that did for us is it gave us permission to have all the million little conversations that we would have normally been having, okay? And so that gives you this space. Now, for a lot of couples, you may end up, especially if you've got that pursuer and that withdrawer, a lot of times what you'll end up with is one person who doesn't want to talk about it at all, and one person who only wants to talk about it. And so if that's the situation, what works best typically is to set aside a time, and it's a time limited time. So we're going to schedule it. We're going to say, okay, we are going to sit down for 30 minutes or an hour, probably no more than an hour. And we are going to talk about the situation. We're going to say what we need to say. We're going to make a decision about whatever treatment we need to decide on, however that looks. And at the end of that hour, you get to leave. You're done. Okay. We have an exit plan. And when that hour is over, we're done. Okay. We're going to hold true to that. And then after that, we have a scheduled time when we're going to go on a date without the epilepsy. We're going to get a break with it. And so that way, each person is getting that need met. We're going to have the conversation. We're going to address the stuff. We're not going to stay stuck only in that. Okay. Now, if you are in that space where it's really hard to kind of get the conversation started, there's this free app. It's called the Gottman Card Deck. And they have all sorts of questions that start your conversations. And that's a really great place to start. Now, they've got several options on there, like all these different card decks on there. So start with the one that says open-ended questions. There's one that is called Love Maps. Don't do that. All it's going to do is make you fight. But do the one that says open-ended questions. And a lot of times that'll get the conversation going and it'll just take off. We want to make sure that we are allowing each other to be fully human. So there's going to be times when outside of the house, we have to go out and be fierce advocates. There are times when we're fighting the school or we're fighting the insurance or we're doing whatever it takes to keep our kids okay. Even at home, there's times when we're stuck in that, epilepsy mom zone of like, all I'm dealing with is seizures, or I'm trying to balance this, or there's COVID and seizures and virtual school, and there's a million different things. And what we really want to do is give each other permission to be fully individuals too, that we get a space where we get to take off that parent hat and get to know each other as humans again, and work through those things that aren't even related to the epilepsy. And then we also want to give each other permission to take on the roles where you succeed. So for a lot of couples, they get stuck maybe in gender roles or in these expectations of what parenting is supposed to look like. And the truth is that probably one of you is better at dealing with the school. And maybe one of you is better at dealing with the meltdowns. And one of you is better at dealing with whatever. And so we want to notice those things and give yourselves permission, even if it doesn't look like any other marriage you know, to sit in those roles that actually fit for you. So I want to think about some healthy habits that can be helpful. One of the first is that I think it's really helpful to find objects that remind you of your love for each other, and especially for times when you felt supported. So I keep a yellow highlighter, a big fat ugly yellow highlighter, like the one you stole from the nurse, in my purse. And what I notice is that if we're having a hard time, that thing finds its way to the top a lot more often. We're looking for things that help us remember things are hard right now, but they will not always be this hard. We still love each other. We're going to make it. We've been through really hard things before, and so we can do this. We want to take some time and decide what we want our family and our relationships to look like. Okay, and so that's especially helpful when we're in a calm state, because especially within PCDH19, a lot of times you go through cycles, and so you go through a space where the seizures are out of control and they're really, really bad and overwhelming, and that's like the only thing that you can focus on. And then you go through times where they quiet down, or we figure out how to manage them, and we kind of cycle back and forth. And so especially when we're in that space where things are a little bit more manageable, we want to focus on rebuilding that relationship, on strengthening it, and kind of creating the space that works for y'all. One of the things that is really helpful for a lot of couples is creating code words. And these can be, you know, going into the holidays, code words are incredibly helpful. But even if you're thinking about things like dealing with family members, dealing with hospitals, we create a code word between the two of you that tells your person, I need out right now, or I need you to take over. Okay? And we use that word, and that tells, and they step up, and maybe they deal with the doctor, or if you're with, you know, somebody's parents, that means, hey, like, get me out of this room right now. And so we go to that space where it's just too much to handle. This also helps a lot in front of the kids. If you're getting to that spot where you're like, I'm about to lose my everything, and we use that code word, we're not telling the kids like, hey, I can't handle you, but your person knows like, hey, I'm gonna step in and I'm gonna help out right now. We wanna make sure as we're doing this that we're letting each other tap out. So we have to be there when it matters, okay? In the crisis moment, there are times in this journey when it's not optional. Even when it sucks, we've gotta show up, we've gotta do it. But we also have to have times that we get to tap out, we get to take a breath and get some rest from the relationship, from parenting, or we can go by ourselves and get some, you know, or go with our friends or do whatever that looks like. We've got to incorporate that into our world, okay? And then what we want to do too, you know, and for a lot of people, they'll use the love languages for this, but we want to notice the way that we and our people feel love. And so if I show you love because, you know, like I'm a huge gift giver. And so if I'm bringing you gifts and I'm showing you my love for that, but really you're just exhausted and you just want my help doing something around the house, then we're going to have this disconnect and nobody's going to be feeling loved. So we want to be noticing how are we showing that love? And then when we go into crisis, we're going to amp it up and we're going to show that more, right? And so that might be like, you know, bringing coffee when you're in the hospital, that like makes a huge difference, or calling or talking or sitting together, or, you know, whatever it is for your person, we want to figure that out and make sure we're showing it. And as we get to that space where we can do that, we also want to be able to ask for what we're needing. When we're needing that stuff, we want to be able to say, hey, what I need is this. What I want you to do is this. I'm feeling really neglected and I need help here. Okay. When we do get into those negative cycles, one of our main rules is that we want to speak our pain, but not cause it. And what that means is that we're going to be able to share, like, look, when you did this, that really, really stung. It hurt so bad. I didn't know what else to do. And you know, here's what happened inside of me. But we're not going to cause pain, okay? Especially not pain that causes deep wounds in the relationship. So one of the things we like to say is we have these pieces, we call them the 4 horsemen of the relationship apocalypse, because, you know, therapists are a little dramatic. But these 4 things, they actually predict divorce better than affairs do. We can heal from affairs. We do that every day. But these 4 horsemen, they're hard to come back from, especially once they get out of control. And so these horsemen are criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Now, stonewalling is where it looks like we're completely shut down. What it typically actually is, though, is people go into that space that says nothing I do is going to make this any better, so I'm just going to shut down. Okay, and a lot of times that cycle looks like somebody's critical, and the other person gets defensive, and then that criticism turns into contempt, and then that defensive person goes into that spot where they're stonewalling and just shut down, right? And then we do this whole thing over and over. And so what we're going to do, we're going to make decisions that we're going to stay involved as much as we can. We're not going to let ourselves shut down. And we're not going to ever attack character. We're not going to go into that critical space that says who you are isn't okay. We can say you did this and I felt this, but we're not going to attack who our people are. And then we're going to learn to make repairs, because we know that we're humans. We're going to mess this all up, and that's just part of it. That's just part of being in a relationship. And so we're going to work on making repairs. The man who did the love languages has has a free quiz online for these things he calls the apology languages. And I think it's a really helpful thing for couples because the idea is that there's these 5 different ways that people apologize, and that if you don't speak those apologies in the same language, then your person may not recognize or feel like they've been apologized to. And so it allows that resentment to just breathe. And so that's a really helpful one for a lot of people. So I've got some conversations, and I've got them kind of divided into conversations with yourself, conversations with your person, and then conversations about parenting. And so I think it's always best when you can to kind of start with those things within yourself. And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about things like, what did I learn about relationships and connection growing up? And how is that playing out now? Are you repeating your parents' marriage? Are you trying to figure out how to be exactly opposite of them? Are you kind of hitting that sweet spot where you learn and do better? I don't know. But you're going to think about, what did you learn, and is it still working for you? And then we want to figure out, where do we fit on that withdrawer pursuer spectrum? Because once we know that, we can notice ourselves shrinking back, and we can notice our person pushing forward, and we can start to recognize that those actions come from love. It feels like attack, it feels like pulling away, and really those are the things that we're not doing them very effectively most of the time, but we're trying as hard as we can to preserve the relationship. And then we want to think about, am I really proud of how I show up in my relationship? Or what needs to change so that I am? Now, our goal is not perfection here, because we're not ever going to reach that, okay? But we do want to think about, like, am I okay with what I'm doing right now? And then I think it's really helpful to look at, what do I love most about my person? I want to make sure that we're taking time and we're figuring out, when are we connected? What do they do that's fantastic? What are the good things about them? Because that stuff can really get lost when we're in so much stress. And then we're going to sit down with our person, and we're going to ask questions like, what does our cycle look like? Where do we get stuck? And we want to take some time on this. We want to really figure out, what does that look like for us? Right? And we're going to ask them some of those same questions. You know, what did you learn about connection? What did you learn about comfort growing up? Right? That's a huge thing that for a lot of people, they'll say, nobody ever comforted me growing up. I don't even know how to take comfort. Or when I was little, mom would give me a hug, or dad would say, chin up, don't be sad, you know, or however that looked like. And so we've learned that that's how we respond when our people are struggling. And then we want to see, is that still working? We want to look, you know, what are your raw spots in the relationship or in parenting? And when do you feel most connected? What do you want our relationship to look like? And what changes would you want to make? And then we want to have some conversations about parenting. One of the biggest things that I think is a really helpful one is to have this conversation where we get quiet and we really think about it, and we ask, you know, what did you dream about parenting? Every parent started off with some dreams, okay? And here's the thing, no parent's actual parenting looks anything like it did before they had kids. That's typical. But there is a difference between imagining your child as a football star and instead they play chess, versus dreaming of a, you know, the top graduate in the school and your child has an intellectual disability. If there's a difference there, this is not neurotypical parenting. And a lot of times when those dreams don't mash up, there's deep grief, okay? Or there's judgment of yourself. You know, so for me, I grew up in the country. I lived on ranches my whole life growing up. And I went into parenting with this idea that my kids were going to be kind of free range and they could go explore in the pasture and with the animals and do the thing. And then it's not always very safe to let my daughter go out and explore the world by herself. I can't, you know, especially if we've been having seizures, she can't just go out in the pasture. And that really, really stings, especially for me because it's my daughter that I'm having to hold close and restrict. That's a hard thing. So I want to recognize that that's a dream that got challenged and is a struggle. Okay? We're going to ask each other, what's the hardest part of parenting? What's the hardest part of the diagnosis or the trauma that we've gone through? And we are going to expect that that's going to look different for the two of you. Okay? And we want to get real honest and ask, are you having trauma symptoms? You know, are you having nightmares? Are you having flashbacks? Are you having anxiety? You know, we see things like depression that get really, really prevalent, and they don't always look like they would or like we would expect that they would. So when we're thinking about especially moms, we see this thing really common that we call functional depression. And so people have this idea that depression looks like hiding in a dark room and never coming out, and everything's black and dark and scary. And the truth is that for most moms, that's just not an option. You still got to get up, you still got to work, you still got to take care of the kids, you got to do the stuff. And so functional depression means that we're getting the things done that have to be done. We're usually doing bare minimum. We're usually really struggling with it, and the whole world has just kind of gone gray. Okay? But it's not going to look like you might expect. The same thing with, you know, with things like nightmares, things like super high anxiety. Those things kind of get really prevalent, especially when we've got stuff like seizures that are really violent in the way they look and in the way they attack our children. Okay? And so we're going to ask all about that, and then we're going to support each other in getting help if that's what's needed. We're going to talk about, when is this parenting journey the hardest for you? When's the hardest for me? When do you feel best about your parenting? Are you a rock star when you go into your IEP meeting? Are you the one that can handle all 77 medications and know everything about it? Are you the one that can roll around on the floor and play? All of that is great. When do you feel best about yourself as a parent? And how can I know when you need my help? Okay. But as we go through this, we're going to give each other just tons and tons and tons of grace. And we're going to look for those times that we might need some extra help. Okay. When we're thinking about getting professional help, like going and seeing a counselor, we want to go before it gets really bad. We don't want to wait. The average couple that goes to couples counseling has been in distress for more than 6 years. There's no reason for that. We want to go when we first start to struggle. If there's any type of abuse or any lack of safety, we need to get in right away. If anybody has any thoughts of hurting themselves or anybody else, you know, those are kind of some obvious times. But also, if you start to find yourself spending all of your time stuck in that negative cycle, we want to get help, right? Because we can break that cycle. We don't have to stay in that space. If we notice that we're arguing in ways that are causing each other wounds, that we walk away from a fight feeling like we've just been emotionally beat up, we want to get some help and change those. If we're struggling to talk about the challenges or connect in the pain, you know, I see a lot of couples that the relationship itself is strong, like they're not in a relationship crisis, but they're in a crisis dealing with their kid's diagnosis or figuring out how to cope with what's going on at home. And so we can work together and they can lean on each other. And then all of a sudden, that mountain's not so tall. We can work through it together. And then if you get to the space where maybe you fought, and it's like, you know what, I'm just too tired to fight anymore, we got to get in therapy. We got to figure out something that helps us get back on track. Okay? But the thing I always want people to remember, that you do not have to be a statistic. We all know, like the vast majority of special needs parents are told really early on that our marriages are doomed for divorce, that, you know, y'all are going to fall apart, you're not going to be able to handle this. And that does not have to be true. We can have some of the best, most beautiful relationships out there. They're just going to take some work, right? And they're going to take some different approaches from what a neurotypical family might have to do. But there is a depth that comes through going through the fire together. I had a friend who was in a really horrible accident with her fiance last year, and we're getting ready. We're sitting in the hospital, and she's worried about, like, tell me it's going to be okay, that our relationship is going to make it through. And I'm like, you know what? I can tell you that you will have a depth that you will not be able to, that you would never have had without me. Okay? It will not be easy. There will be hard things. But when you go through those really hard things together and you make it through as a couple, there is a depth that comes from that. And so that's kind of our goal, is to do the things that it takes to get that secure connection, to feel safe with each other, and to nourish that love enough that we walk through that fire together and we're stronger at the other end of it. Okay. So this is my contact information. And because of licensure laws, I personally can only see people in Texas right now. But even if you're not in Texas, if you're needing some help finding a counselor, just reach out, and I'm happy to. I'm always happy to chat. So